Imagine the most powerful man in Rome, adored by some, hated by others, walking into the Senate with no idea it would be his last day. Julius Caesar, the general who conquered lands, defeated enemies, and became almost a king within the Republic, was surrounded and stabbed by those he trusted the most. Among them, a familiar face, Brutus, his godson, almost a son. The city was in shock. The streets that once celebrated Caesar's victories now echoed with the fear of an inevitable war. But Caesar didn't just leave behind a military legacy. He left a name, influence, and an heir, Octavian, a frail, sickly young man whom no one took seriously. But Caesar's blood ran in his veins, and that blood cried out for revenge, justice, and power. Hold on. Before we continue, I need your help. YouTube only shares this video with more people if there's a lot of interaction. So without your comment, this knowledge might get buried and never reach those who need it. If this content makes sense to you, comment 1. If you disagree, comment 0 and tell me why. I want to see at least 100 comments here so YouTube understands that this topic needs to be spread. So comment now and be part of this mission to uncover the secrets of ancient Rome. Right after Caesar's death, Rome became a real minefield. The Senate was divided, the people were furious, and the one who tried to take control of the situation was Mark Antony, one of Caesar's most trusted men. His funeral speech was so fiery that it turned grief into hatred and pointed the finger at the assassins. Meanwhile, Octavian, newly arrived in the capital, was trying to figure out how a young man with no army and little experience could compete with political giants. But he was smarter than he looked. He started gaining allies, making deals, and drawing closer to the Senate, which at that moment wanted only one thing: to control the chaos. And in that tense scenario, the first steps toward a new war began to take shape. Rome was boiling. On one side, Mark Antony with his fame and charisma. On the other, Octavian, the young heir quietly rising behind the scenes. But neither of them had enough power alone to defeat the enemies still lurking. So, in a bold move, they decided to form an alliance with a third man, Lepidus, a former ally of Caesar. Thus, the feared Second Triumvirate was born. But this union wasn't made of handshakes. It was made of blood. They created lists of people who had to die: senators, knights, influential citizens. Anyone who appeared on that list became an enemy of the state, and those who turned them in or killed them were rewarded. It was political cleansing disguised as justice. Octavian, Mark Antony, and Lepidus used this strategy to raise money and keep soldiers loyal. After all, war is waged with swords, but also with coins, and every fallen body was one more step toward absolute power. With the triumvirate in place and internal enemies being hunted down, it was time to deal with the real targets: Brutus and Cassius, the men behind Caesar's assassination. They were far from Rome, gathering troops in the east, confident they could still restore the old republic. But Octavian and Antony knew they couldn't let that threat live any longer. They assembled 28 legions, yes, 28 full armies, and crossed the sea toward Greece. There, 2 brutal battles would mark history. Philippi. In the first, Cassius, thinking all was lost, took his own life. He didn't know that Brutus, his ally, had won on the other side of the battlefield. But that victory didn't last long. In the second battle, Brutus was crushed, his men defeated, his cause buried. And he, with no way out, also chose death. Thus, Caesar's assassins were no longer a threat. But the feeling of mission accomplished didn't last long, because now, Octavian and Mark Antony knew there was only one obstacle left between them, and total control of Rome. Each other. With Brutus and Cassius gone, it seemed peace would finally reign. It only seemed that way, because now the problem was inside the triumvirate itself. Mark Antony was growing more and more distant, both geographically and in priorities. While Octavian managed the west, Antony was living in the east, and with company that would change everything: Cleopatra, Queen of Egypt. To make things worse, Octavian ended his marriage to Claudia, daughter of Fulvia, Antony's wife, a gesture that was far more than personal. It was, political. Fulvia was furious. Together with Antony's brother Lucius, she raised an army in Italy to face Octavian. It was a short but bloody war. The city of Perugia was besieged, conquered, and set on fire. Octavian ordered the execution of 300 senators and knights, accusing them of treason. The message was clear: don't challenge Caesar's heir. Rome began to understand that Octavian was no longer a boy trying to prove himself. He was willing to do anything, and with each step, he was becoming the center of power. If this content is making sense to you so far, do this. Give me a sign. Comment 1 below so I know you're with me on this journey. And remember, YouTube only spreads this knowledge if there's a lot of interaction. If you haven't commented yet, now is the time. I want to see this video full of opinions so this topic keeps reaching more people. While Octavian was strengthening his base in Rome, Mark Antony was losing himself in the luxury of the East, specifically in Cleopatra's arms. He had children with her, gave her territories, and began acting as if he were the king of his own empire. To Rome, this was a slap in the face. A Roman general handing power to a foreign queen? That was pure betrayal. But Octavian didn't respond with swords. He responded with strategy. He got hold of Mark Antony's secret will, which said that everything, including his assets and conquests, would go to Cleopatra and their children. When the people found out, it was an unprecedented scandal, and Octavian, with a single speech, turned the entire public opinion against the man who had once been his ally. Now, war was no longer a matter of time. It was a certainty. The moment all of Rome had been waiting for arrived. Octavian versus Mark Antony. No more deals, no more treaties. It was war, but this time, not on land, on the sea. In 31 BC, the naval forces of the two giants clashed off the coast of Actium in Greece. Antony was alongside Cleopatra, with a powerful fleet and massive ships, but he made a fatal mistake. His sailors were inexperienced. On the other side, Octavian had smaller, much faster ships, commanded by a true naval war genius, Agrippa. Antony's plan was to use the weight of his ships to crush the enemy fleet, but Octavian already knew that. He ordered Agrippa to surround the flanks and attack from both sides. What followed was a bloodbath at sea. As Antony's ships were destroyed one by one, Cleopatra fled, and he, seeing defeat before his eyes, had no choice but to follow. The fleet was annihilated, and with it, the last breath of resistance against Octavian. After the humiliation at Actium, Antony and Cleopatra fled to Egypt, trying to gather forces. But they knew Octavian wouldn't stop until it was all over, and that's exactly what he did. He marched with his troops to the gates of Alexandria. Cornered, without allies, and watching his empire crumble, Antony received false news. He was told Cleopatra had taken her own life. Desperate, he fell on his own sword. When Cleopatra found out, she also chose not to go on living. It's believed she used a venomous snake, brought by one of her servants, to end her life. It was the final act of a couple who tried to defy Rome, and lost. Octavian entered Alexandria as a conqueror. He imprisoned Cleopatra's youngest children and ordered the execution of Caesarion, her son with Julius Caesar. The message was clear: there would be no room for rival bloodlines. With that, Egypt ceased to be an independent kingdom and officially became part of the Roman Empire, and Octavian now had nothing to fear. At that point, no one dared to challenge Octavian anymore. He had defeated everyone: Caesar's assassins, political rivals, Mark Antony, Cleopatra, and even the people's fear. With Egypt under his control, he now owned the greatest source of wealth in the Mediterranean. Gold, grain, power, it was all in his hands. But instead of returning to Rome as a power-hungry tyrant, he did something even smarter. He gave power back to the Senate, as if he were tired of politics. But behind that apparent resignation, he kept real control of everything: armies, provinces, decisions. That's how he received a new name: Augustus. He was no longer Octavian. He was now Rome's first emperor. And the most incredible part? He did it without needing a crown on his head, just with strategy, patience, and blood. The Republic, the one that began with Cicero, votes and debates, was dead. In its place, an empire was born, and the world would never be the same again. Octavian, now Augustus, seemed to have conquered everything, but he knew that keeping power was even harder than taking it. So, little by little, he withdrew from the public eye, letting the Senate believe it was in charge, when in fact he controlled every move from behind the scenes. Without raising his voice, Without needing violence, he created a new model of government. And he did it, with such mastery that even history's greatest generals couldn't replicate it. Rome was entering a new era of order, expansion, and also shadows. Because what many don't realize is that the real game of power was just beginning. And behind the glories of the empire, new betrayals, conspiracies, and strategies would emerge, shaping the destiny of the world for centuries to come. If this video held your attention until now, go ahead and leave a like. It shows YouTube that this content is valuable and helps spread this knowledge to more people. And before you leave, click on the video that's now showing on your screen. It'll take you straight to a part of history few know about, but that could completely change the way you see the Roman Empire. Trust me, you won't want to miss it. See you there.